Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into one of the most intriguing and, frankly, often misunderstood fields, psychology. When you hear psychology, your mind might conjure images of therapy sessions or perhaps just talking about your feelings.
Sure, that's common.
But for this deep dive, we're going to pull back the curtain and really dig into what it means for psychology to be a science.
Yeah, a rigorous one.
And not just any science, but a biosocial one. We're going to explore how psychologists rigorously study the incredible complexities of human behavior, thought, and emotion.
It's quite a task.
Our mission is to uncover surprising insights and reveal how psychology tackles even the most seemingly hard-to-grasp concepts with truly precise scientific methods, and how it explores that intricate dance between our biology and our social world.
That's precisely right. Our primary source for this deep dive is a comprehensive textbook on human psychology from 1976.
A bit of a classic, then.
Definitely foundational. It acts as a guide, touching on everything from, basic processes like perception and learning.
Right.
More complex areas like personality, abnormal behavior, social dynamics, the whole gamut, really.
Okay.
Our goal is to extract the most important nuggets from this rich material, giving you a valuable shortcut to being truly well-informed about the scientific underpinnings of this vast and crucial field.
So let's start with a foundational question then. When we typically think of science, our minds often jump to disciplines like physics or chemistry.
Sure, the hard sciences.
Exactly. We picture precise measurements, controlled experiments, tangible results. But how does psychology, a field that grapples with concepts as seemingly intangible as feelings, thoughts, even something as abstract as imagery,
Yeah, the fuzzy stuff.
how does it establish itself as a rigorous scientific discipline? What truly makes psychology scientific in this context?
That's a crucial starting point, and it gets right to the core of the field's identity. The source material emphasizes what it calls methodological behaviorism.
Methodological behaviorism. Okay.
Now, this isn't about philosophy, like whether consciousness really exists or how it feels subjectively.
Okay, it's not that kind of debate.
No. Instead, it's a pragmatic commitment. It's about applying the scientific method to psychological problems.
Right.
Essentially, it means psychology focuses on what can be objectively observed and measured. Even if those feelings or thoughts are internal, it's about making the intangible, tangible enough for scientific study, getting a handle on it.
Measurable, though. Even for something as internal and fleeting as imagination. That sounds like quite a stretch. How do you objectively measure imagery?
What's truly fascinating here is precisely how the early researchers addressed that. Even apparently nebulous terms like imagery can be, as the source puts it, tied down securely to observable facts.
Tied down. Okay, how?
Consider an intriguing example from the source. An experiment where subjects were asked to imagine sexual situations for 20-second intervals. While the subjects reported what they saw in their imagination, researchers simultaneously measured something very concrete. Changes in penis size using a plethysmograph.
A plethy what now?
Plethysmograph. It's simply a device that measures volume changes in a body part.
Wow. Okay. So what did they find?
The results were striking. The more erotic the reported imagery, the greater the measurable enlargement.
No kidding.
Yeah. It demonstrated a direct link between an internal, subjective process, the imagery, and a measurable external physiological event.
Right.
Thereby validating the reality of that internal process through objective observation. It's proof that what happens in our minds isn't just in our heads. It has real, measurable correlates.
That's certainly a surprising and very direct example of tying down the nebulous.
It gets the point across, doesn't it?
It certainly does, but it also brings up another point the source makes about science, especially young sciences, needing to oversimplify. That seems almost counterintuitive. Shouldn't we be striving for absolute fidelity to reality from the start?
Right, you'd think so. But if you connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes clear why oversimplification isn't a flaw, but actually a necessary initial step for any young science. Psychology, like any developing scientific field, must oversimplify to begin. The source uses excellent analogies.
Like what?
Well, for centuries, astronomy treated the Earth as a perfect sphere.
Which it isn't, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Grossly inaccurate by today's standards, but it was perfectly adequate for astronomers trying to understand our planetary system back then.
Makes sense.
Similarly, Galileo, when demonstrating his law of falling bodies, he could ignore distinctions between, say, a human and a pig.
Because?
Because for the purpose of studying gravity, that distinction was irrelevant. It didn't affect the law he was demonstrating.
Gotcha.
The point isn't to be uncomplimentary to humanity, just as Copernicus's heliocentric model wasn't meant as an insult, nor Darwin's theory of evolution.
Right, it's just science isolating variables.
Precisely. It's about abstracting, isolating these invariant bits of experience to understand fundamental laws. Without this simplification, science couldn't even begin to bring order to the chaos of blooming, buzzing confusion, which constitutes experience, as William James famously put it.
So the goal isn't immediate, complete truth, but a simplified model that allows us to make predictions and build understanding, step by step.
Exactly. The acid test, as the source calls it, of whether psychological science has done its job properly. It's not whether its findings immediately appeal to the average person, or if the model of human conduct it puts forth is flattering.
So it's not about making us feel good about ourselves.
Not primarily, no. Rather, it's whether it generates models that can predict and explain human behavior effectively.
Prediction, that's the key.
That's the key. Think about how our understanding of reinforcement allows us to predict the effectiveness of, say, a new educational program or a public health campaign. It's not just theory, it's about predicting real-world human action.
Right.
Like Newton's model of physics, it was the best available for 300 years, despite its later limitations revealed by Einstein. Psychology's current models are the best we have for now, providing valuable predictive power, even if they'll be refined later.
Okay, this makes sense. It's about building useful models that work. Now, here's where it really gets fascinating for me. Our source material makes a very strong statement. Human beings are both biological organisms and products of a social environment.
The biosocial paradigm.
Yeah. It even calls out sociotropes and biotropes, people who stress one side over the other as dangerous. That's quite a bold claim, especially for a textbook from the 70s.
It is strong language, isn't it?
So what does this paradigm of interaction truly mean in practice, and why is ignoring either side considered so perilous?
It means we must constantly, and I think with humility, consider how biological and social factors interact. It's a dynamic interplay.
Not just one or the other.
Never just one or the other. The danger involved in that kind of one-sided enthusiasm being a sociotrope, someone who blames everything on society and upbringing.
Right, nurture only.
Or a biotrope, someone who attributes everything to genes and brain chemistry.
Nature only.
The danger is simply that we try to impose our prejudices on nature, rather than allowing nature to teach us what the facts are.
So we force the data to fit our preferred view.
Exactly. Ignoring one side leads to a distorted view of human psychology, and ultimately to incomplete or even harmful solutions, whether we're talking therapy, education, or public policy.
I see.
This perspective acknowledges that fundamental drives like thirst, hunger, sex, these are biological, right? We share them with other animals. And emotions like fear, rage, lust, they govern our conduct just as they do in cats or raccoons. Any effective model of human conduct has to embody these biological facts prominently.
But that's not the whole story.
Not at all. The model must also contain other features, things that are clearly difficult, if not impossible, to replicate in animal work. That requires studying human beings in all their complexity to make the model more lifelike, more accurate.
That immediately brings up the age-old debate in psychology, the relevance of animal work to understanding human behavior. The source discusses strong arguments against what some might dismissively call rat psychology.
Ah, yes, the rat psychology critique.
What are those common pushbacks, and how does this biosocial paradigm navigate that tension?
It's a really important question, and it's been a point of dispute for a long, long time. Arguments against generalizing from animals to humans are indeed quite strong.
What are they specifically?
Well, critics say that species differences are simply too large, especially when comparing, lowly animals like rats to humans who possess complex language and abstract thought.
The language barrier is huge.
It is. They argue that superficial similarities, like rats running mazes or maybe children learning simple motor habits, those don't really extend to specifically human learning, which is far more nuanced and involves symbolic representation, planning, all sorts of things.
Fair enough. So given those valid criticisms, how can animal studies possibly be relevant to us, if at all? Is there any justification?
The source offers a nuanced perspective here. It doesn't just dismiss animal work wholesale. While acknowledging the differences, it counters that evolution teaches us important links. Rats, like humans, have central nervous systems, they have cortices, they have autonomic nervous systems that mediate emotion.
Shared biology.
Because of these shared fundamental biological structures, results from mammals can be suggestive for understanding human behavior. But, and this is crucial, before results are transferred from one species to another, it must be demonstrated that such transfer is permissible.
So you can't just assume.
You absolutely cannot just assume. Neither wholesale acceptance nor wholesale rejection of animal experiment results in human application is justified. Each case has to be examined on its own merits. You need evidence for the transfer.
Okay, so case by case. Is there an example of where that transfer was justified?
Yeah, a good one discussed is the important work of J. Masterman back in 1943 involving cats.
Cats. Okay, what did he do?
He would teach cats to get food from a box. Simple enough. But then he introduced an electric shock when they touched the box.
Ouch. Creates a conflict, I imagine.
Exactly. An approach avoidance conflict. The hungry cats were driven towards the food, but the pain avoidance pushed them away.
Stuck between a rock and a hard place. Or a shock plate.
Precisely. This situation, studied in great detail later by N. Miller, is described as very conducive to the genesis of neurotic behavior.
Neurotic behavior in cats.
Yes. And what's critical here is that this neurotic behavior, observable in Masterman's cats, the source explicitly states, it has also been found true in human behavior.
Ah, so there's the link.
There's the demonstrated link. So while human and cat behavior are obviously not identical, this case study shows a relevant, transferable principle regarding conflict and the development of neurotic tendencies.
Okay.
It underscores the core idea. It's not all or nothing. We have to constantly ask, what can we actually transfer from animal studies to humans, and what absolutely requires human-specific research, especially involving things like language and complex cognition.
That's a powerful example of the biosocial dance right there. You've got the biological drive, hunger, interacting with an environmental learning experience, the shock to create complex behavioral outcomes that, in principle, parallel human experience.
Nicely put.
So, with this scientific lens in hand, how do psychologists apply these rigorous methods to unpack specific aspects of human experience? Let's start with something really fundamental, like how we learn and change behavior. Conditioning, right?
Exactly. One core area that has been systematically studied through rigorous methods is conditioning, which, simply put, refers to a measurable change in responsiveness to stimuli over time.
A change in responsiveness.
Yeah, it can involve learning new responses or changing existing ones, often towards increased efficiency or adaptation.
And when we talk about conditioning, Pavlov is probably the first name that pops into everyone's head, isn't it? The dogs, the bell.
Absolutely. Pavlov's dogs. Classic stuff.
Can you quickly break down the core terminology he established? Just a refresher.
Sure. In Pavlov's classic experiments, like pairing a buzzer with food to elicit salivation in a dog, he established key terms. The food, which naturally produces salivation, is the unconditioned stimulus, or UCS.
UCS food. Got it.
And the salivation it naturally evokes is the unconditioned response, UCR.
UCR salivation.
Through repeated pairings, the initially neutral buzzer becomes the conditioned stimulus, the CS.
CS bell or buzzer.
Right. And eventually it evokes salivation on its own as the conditioned response, the CR.
CR, salivation to the bell. Simple but profound.
Profound, yes.
Yeah.
And it's crucial for effective forward conditioning that the more intense or significant stimulus, like the food, follows the neutral one, the buzzer, closely in time.
Order matters.
Order matters a lot. If it's reversed, in what's called backward conditioning, where the food comes before the bell, the effects are much less profound, often negligible.
Interesting. Now, building on Pavlov, there was Thorndike and Skinner, right? They took this further.
They did. Towards the turn of the century, E.L. Thorndike announced his law of effect.
Law of effect. What's that?
This principle essentially states that animals, and this includes people, will tend to repeat activities that have led to pleasant consequences.
Rewards.
And shun those that have led to unpleasant ones.
Yeah.
Makes intuitive sense, right?
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
Then B.F. Skinner, a major figure in American psychology, expanded on this notion about half a century later. He based his law of reinforcement on extensive work, mostly with rats and pigeons, in his famous Skinner boxes.
Okay, law of reinforcement. How's that different?
Skinner differentiated types of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is essentially a reward, something pleasant is added, which leads to the repetition of a behavior.
Makes the behavior more likely.
Exactly. And negative reinforcement is not punishment. This is key. Negative reinforcement is when an undesirable stimulus is removed, which also leads to the repetition of the behavior that removed it. Think escaping something unpleasant.
Ah, okay. So both positive and negative reinforcement increase behavior. Punishment would decrease it.
Precisely. And punishment, or the simple abandonment of a behavior due to unpleasant consequences, relates more back to Thorndike's initial formulation, though Skinner certainly studied its effects too.
So how does this translate into practical, real-world applications for modifying behavior, especially challenging ones? The source mentioned a fascinating example with children that seemed, well, almost harsh.
It can lead to very clear-cut approaches based on observable outcomes, which sometimes conflict with our intuitions about what's nice.
Like the head-banging example.
Exactly. Take the head-banging children mentioned in the source material. According to operant conditioning principles, when a child starts to bang their head, the mother's instructed to pick them up without emotion.
No comforting.
No comforting. Take them to a small room and lock them in alone for 10 minutes. When they're let out, she again shows no emotion, doesn't scold them.
So basically isolating them immediately after the behavior.
Yes. This timeout procedure acts as a form of negative reinforcement, or perhaps punishment, depending on the exact interpretation, making that head-banging action less likely to occur again because it leads directly to an undesirable consequence, isolation.
Okay, I see the logic now. It removes any potential reward, like attention.
Exactly. What's truly insightful here is how this seemingly counterintuitive approach, not comforting the child in that moment, can be far more effective. It demonstrates the hidden logic of behavior that traditional empathy might sometimes miss, or even inadvertently positively reinforce the wrong behavior if, say, hugging and attention followed the head-banging.
Right. If the child was seeking attention, comforting would actually strengthen the behavior.
Precisely the point made by some contrasting psychoanalytic recommendations at the time. The behavioral approach focuses purely on the contingency and the outcome.
That's a very direct and clear application of the theory. Skinner really extended this beyond simple behaviors, didn't he? I mean, he had grander visions.
Oh, absolutely. Skinner showed the immense power of reinforcement in shaping behavior, even highly complex actions that we perform daily. Things like walking, talking, driving a car, flying a plane. He argued these are all built up through reinforcement histories.
Wow. Even language.
He analyzed language itself as a system of operant responses, shaped by social reinforcement. A controversial view, but influential. And he pointed to how various forms of reinforcement are used, often implicitly, in political, social, and economic control.
Like how?
For instance, he described ordinary wages as basically fixed ratio schedules of reinforcement for controlling economic behavior. You work a certain amount, you get paid.
Never thought of it that way, but yeah.
More ambitiously, he even described a utopian community called Walden II in his novel, where the principles of learning were systematically applied to create what he saw as a more ideal form of social organization, based entirely on positive reinforcement.
Walden II, right? I've heard of that. So his legacy extends far beyond the lab. It's about the pervasive nature of reinforcement in our lives, whether we recognize it or not.
Absolutely. It's a powerful lens for understanding behavior at many levels.
Okay, so that covers external behavior modification, but psychology also delves into inner states, like emotions.
Right.
That seems even trickier. How do scientific methods manage to measure and understand something as complex and subjective as emotion?
This is where it gets really complex, you're right, but also incredibly fascinating. The source highlights that our circulatory system acts as a kind of sounding board for changes in our consciousness.
A sounding board, how so?
Even slight shifts in feeling or attention can make it, well, reverberate, sending waves of constriction and dilation down our arteries. Blushing, going pale.
Physiological responses.
Exactly. However, while physiological reactivity is consistently confirmed in emotion, heart rate changes, sweating, etc., research has also revealed something called idiosyncratic patterning.
Idiosyncratic patterning, meaning?
Meaning, contrary to an older assumption of mass action, like your whole sympathetic nervous system just firing off uniformly,
Right.
individuals actually respond differently to stress. One person might show a big jump in blood pressure, another might start sweating profusely, and yet another might experience heightened muscle tension.
So my stress response isn't necessarily the same as yours physiologically?
Exactly. It suggests the physiological response to emotion isn't uniform across everyone. There are individual patterns.
Interesting. But physiology is just one part. What about the feeling itself, the subjective experience?
That's where cognition comes in, and it's crucial. Schachter's influential work back in 1966 highlighted the cognitive determinants of emotional states.
Cognitive determinants, so our thoughts shape our feelings.
In a very specific way. His theory suggests that physiological arousal, the racing heart, the sweaty palms, is actually quite general, quite nonspecific. And it's the label we give to that arousal, which is determined by the surrounding situation, our interpretation of events, that dictates whether we experience it as anger or joy or fear or something else.
The label dictates the feeling. How did he test that?
It's a famous experiment. He had subjects receive an epinephrine injection that's adrenaline, which causes physiological arousal.
Right. Makes your heart pound.
Exactly. But he divided them into groups. One group was correctly informed about the injection's effects. You'll feel shaky, your heart will race. Another group was totally ignorant of the effects. A third was actively misinformed. This might make your feet feel numb. And there was a placebo group, of course.
Okay, so different expectations.
Precisely. Then, while the drug was taking effect, an actor, a confederate, interacted with the subjects. This actor either acted euphorically, playing with paper airplanes, laughing, or acted angrily, complaining, getting frustrated.
What happened?
The results were striking. Subjects who had no explanation for their bodily state, the ignorant and misinformed groups, were readily manipulable into disparate feeling states.
They caught the emotion from the actor.
Essentially, yes. If the actor was euphoric, they reported feeling euphoric. If the actor was angry, they reported feeling angry. Their unexplained arousal got labeled by the situation.
Oh, wow.
But those who were informed about the epinephrine and its likely effects, they proved relatively immune to these manipulated cognitions. They knew why their heart was racing, so they didn't need to attribute it to the actor's mood.
That's amazing. So our interpretation of our own bodily sensations, heavily influenced by what's happening around us, is what creates the experience of emotion.
That's the core of Schachter's two-factor theory, yes. Arousal plus cognition equals emotion.
If that's the case, then what does this mean for studying emotion in animals? Can they even have the same kind of emotional experience if cognition plays such a big role?
That raises an important question, and it brings us back to the limits of animal research in certain areas. While animal work, studies on cats and dogs and rats, can certainly confirm physiological reactivity and emotion. They show how their viscera and nervous systems respond.
The biological part.
Yes, the biological part. But it cannot, by definition, test emotional experience, the subjective feeling.
Because you can't ask a cat how it feels.
Exactly. The source is explicit on this point. You can only truly determine what an individual is feeling by asking them. Therefore, only human studies are appropriate for testing theories that consider emotional experience as a major component, like Schachter's.
Okay.
Animal experimentation, while valuable for the physiological mechanics, just has inherent limitations when it comes to the subjective, cognitive dimensions of emotion.
That's a really important distinction to keep in mind. And speaking of cognition, it seems like our conscious awareness and expectations play a much more dynamic role in conditioning than just simple stimulus-response pairings suggest, especially in humans.
Well, absolutely. When it comes to human conditioning, cognitive factors are immensely powerful. They can often lead to sudden change in responses, not just gradual learning curves.
Sudden change? How so?
Well, for instance, Mower, back in 1938, observed that an apparent conditioned autonomic response in humans, like a change in heart rate, could be instantly established and just as quickly abolished, merely by controlling the subject's state of expectancy or preparatory set. Just telling them what to expect could turn the response on or off.
Just by telling them? Wow.
Yeah. And even more striking, a classic study by Cook and Harris in 1937 showed that the skin resistance response, another physiological measure often used in conditioning, could be established in human subjects simply by verbally instructing them about the CS-UCS relationship.
Without any actual pairing.
Without the actual repeated pairings of, say, a sound and a mild shock, just telling them this sound will be followed by a shock was enough to produce the conditioned physiological response to the sound alone.
That indicates that conscious awareness can basically bypass the need for traditional associative learning through repetition.
It certainly seems to play a massive role, yes.
Are there other examples of how instructions or awareness affect conditioning?
Definitely. Consider an experiment on the conditioned eyelid response blinking to a stimulus that predicts a puff of air.
Okay.
Subjects given facilitatory instructions like, just let your reactions take care of themselves, performed much better, showed more conditioned blinks than subjects given inhibitory instructions, such as concentrate on not blinking until you feel the puff of air.
So trying not to be conditioned makes you less conditionable.
It does. And interestingly, the conditioning curves, when plotted, showed that these two curves separated rapidly right at the beginning and then became parallel.
What does that suggest?
It suggests there might be two interacting processes at play. First, A quick-acting cognitive set the effect of the instruction, which has its full strength very early on. And second, a slower-to-establish, more automatic conditioned eyelid reflex, which builds up gradually in both groups.
So it's not just a simple reflex building up. Our conscious mind, our cognitive set, can set the stage for how our body responds, or even try to override it.
That seems to be a good way to put it. The cognitive layer is incredibly influential in humans.
And what about the persistence of learned responses? Like in avoidance behavior, learning to do something to avoid a shock, for example. Why do those responses sometimes stick around even when the shock is gone? Does cognition play a role there too?
Yes, very much so. The failure to easily extinguish avoidance responses, even when the aversive stimulus is no longer present, has been explored. Seligman and Johnston in 1973 offered an explanation in terms of expectancies and safety signals.
Expectancies and safety signals. Explain that.
They argue that stimuli that have been paired with the absence of shock can become rewarding in themselves. They become safety signals.
Ah, okay. A sign that things are okay.
Right. So an animal or a person might continue to respond to avoid the original danger, even when it's no longer there, because doing so reliably produces these safety signals. The absence of shock, signaled by these cues, positively reinforces the continued avoidance responding.
So the feeling of safety becomes its own reward, keeping the avoidance going.
Exactly. The animal develops expectancies. This response leads to potential shock. This other response leads to safety. Their theory explicitly introduces two crucial components. A cognitive element, the organism stores information about these contingencies, these expectancies, and an emotional element, the animal prefers safety, no fear, over danger, fear.
It's a complex interplay again, not just stimulus response, but thinking and feeling about the consequences.
Precisely. It highlights a complex interplay of cognitive and emotional processes, even in seemingly basic learned behaviors like avoidance.
This is truly insightful, showing how deeply intertwined our minds are with our behaviors. It makes me wonder, does this conditioning extend beyond just basic fears or physical responses? Can we actually condition things like attitudes or even our values?
That's a great question, and the answer, according to the source, is a resounding yes. The evidence on the conditioning of attitudes, values, even aspects of language, though perhaps less obvious than fear conditioning, is considered equally significant.
Really? How would you condition an attitude?
Razran, back in 1940, conducted a fascinating experiment. He had subjects rate various socio-political slogans, things like America for America or Workers of the World Unite, for their personal approval.
Okay, get a baseline rating.
Right. Then he split the slogans into two sets. One set was repeatedly presented while the subjects were enjoying a free lunch.
Nice association.
The other set was presented while the subjects were forced to inhale putrid odors.
Not so nice.
Definitely not. After several sessions of these pairings, he had them rate the slogans again. The slogans, paired with the pleasant free lunch, showed significant increases in approval ratings. Those paired with the unpleasant odors showed significant decreases.
Just from pairing them with lunch or bad smells.
Just from that pairing. Razran also discussed techniques for conditioning away social bias prejudice by presenting stimuli related to the disliked group while subjects were enjoying pleasant lunches, trying to counter-condition negative attitudes.
So simply associating something neutral as a slogan, maybe even a group of people with a pleasant or unpleasant experience, can fundamentally alter our evaluation of it. That's quite powerful.
It is, isn't it?
It makes you think about everything from advertising associating products with happy feelings to political rhetoric associating opponents with negative emotions. It's almost unsettling how easily our preferences might be shaped without us even realizing it.
What's truly insightful here is the underlying general principle. Any neutral stimulus, consistently paired with primary affective arousal, that basic positive feeling from food or negative feeling from pain or bad smells, will tend to start eliciting a similar affective arousal on its own.
The feeling transfers.
The feeling transfers. And this, the source argues, leads to the development of motives and evaluative dispositions attitudes, values that can become relatively stable and permanent determinants of our behavior. It underscores how our experiences, even seemingly simple associative ones, can profoundly shape how we feel about and react to the world.
Okay, that's a huge area. Now, another major focus of psychology is understanding why we're all so wonderfully uniquely different from each other, individual differences.
Right. Personality, intelligence.
So how do we scientifically measure and explain these differences? And critically, how do we try to disentangle the roots, the age-old nature versus nurture question? Where do genetics and environment fit in?
This area heavily relies on sophisticated statistical methods, particularly a technique called factor analysis.
Factor analysis. What does that do?
In simple terms, it's a statistical tool that helps researchers take a huge amount of data, like responses to hundreds of personality questions, or scores on dozens of different mental tests, and figure out if there are just a few core underlying dimensions or factors that explain most of the variation in that data. It helps find the basic structure.
Boiling it down to essentials.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When it comes to intelligence, a key measure that emerged partly from this kind of analysis is the intelligence quotient, or IQ.
IQ, everyone's heard of it, but what is it technically?
Technically, as originally conceived, IQ is derived by dividing a person's mental age, MA, determined by their performance on standardized tests relative to age norms by their actual chronological age, CA, and then multiplying by 100.
MA over CA times 100.
Right. So by definition, an average person whose mental age matches their chronological age has an IQ of 100.
And what's significant about IQ scores?
What's important to note, according to the source, is that IQ, once measured by properly constructed tests administered by qualified psychologists, is remarkably constant after about age 6 to 8.
It stays stable throughout life.
Relatively stable, yes, unless there's significant brain damage or some other major external interference. This constancy is a critical finding, suggesting it measures a fairly stable underlying ability or set of abilities.
But the big debate, of course, is always nature versus nurture when it comes to intelligence. The source mentions a figure, 80% heredity for IQ variance. That sounds incredibly high to me. What kind of evidence could possibly support such a strong genetic influence, especially when environments seem so incredibly varied?
That's a fair question, and it is a figure that often surprises people and sparks debate. If we connect this back to the biosocial perspective, the source presents this as a finding derived from various lines of evidence available at the time, particularly twin and adoption studies. The well-accepted figure presented in this 1976 text, derived from numerous proofs, is that approximately 80% of the variance, the differences between people in IQ scores within the population studied, was attributable to heredity, and about 20% was attributed to environmental factors.
80-20. How did they try to separate those influences?
Consider studies like the orphanage example described in the source to understand the reasoning. Researchers studied children who were placed in an orphanage from a very early age, meaning they couldn't be cared for by their biological mothers.
Okay.
Now, the conditions in an orphanage, while maybe not ideal, are designed to expose children to a remarkably similar environment. Same teachers, food, companions, daily routines, building.
Much more uniform than typical home environments.
Much more uniform, approaching what would be humanly possible for environmental equality, even if not perfect. Now, if you believe environment is paramount, you'd expect this highly similar environment to significantly reduce the variation in IQ scores among the children, right? They should become more alike.
Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it?
The studies found hardly any change in the variance of IQs among the children compared to children raised in more varied environments. The elimination of major environmental differences made practically no difference to the variation in IQ, amounting to less than a 10% effect, according to the source's interpretation.
So even in a very similar environment, the kids still showed roughly the same spread of IQ scores.
Exactly. This was interpreted as strong evidence that the observed range of intelligence was largely accounted for by inherent genetic differences, which still express themselves even under relatively uniform environmental conditions.
That's quite a compelling, if perhaps controversial, piece of evidence that's presented there. What about sex differences in IQ? Is there a measurable difference between men and women on average?
This raises an important question, especially given historical biases and stereotypes. The development of objective intelligence tests, the source argues, drastically changed old-fashioned views.
How so?
The objective facts emerging from testing show that intelligence tests generally find exact equality between the sexes in overall IQ score.
No overall difference.
No overall difference. If slight differences are found, usually among younger children, girls, if anything, tend to be slightly superior to boys on average.
Interesting. But are there differences in specific types of ability?
Yes, that's where some differences do tend to emerge consistently. Women tend to excel, on average, in tests of rote memory and verbal ability.
Okay, memory and language.
Men, on the other hand, tend to do better, on average, on tests of numerical reasoning and complex mathematical reasoning, particularly when abstract numerical entities are involved, and also often in spatial reasoning.
Math and spatial skills. Now, the crucial question. Are those differences biological or learned?
And that's the million-dollar question the source acknowledges. It's not definitively known from data presented whether these specific ability differences are purely biological or if they're significantly influenced by upbringing, social expectations, educational opportunities, and cultural influences. It likely underscores the ongoing biosocial interaction again.
Right, the interaction is key. So while IQ tests show overall equality, there are these intriguing specific cognitive strengths that differ on average. Now, what about the common criticisms often leveled against IQ testing itself? People raise concerns.
They do. Valid concerns need addressing.
For example, the idea that heredity and environment are so complexly interwoven they simply can't be teased apart reliably, despite the orphanage studies, or the criticism that the selection of items on IQ tests is somehow arbitrary or culturally biased.
These are valid points to raise, and the source addresses them directly. Regarding the intertwining of heredity and environment, it acknowledges the complexity. It's similar to how Galileo's laws of motion ideally apply in a perfect vacuum, but here on Earth, friction and air resistance are always present, complicating things.
It's never perfectly clean.
It's never perfectly clean. But in psychology, we can try to construct tests that rely to a greater or lesser extent on environmental factors, specifically cultural knowledge. Tests least dependent on specific cultural learning are often called culture-fair or culture-reduced tests.
Like what kind of tests?
These often involve things like copying geometric figures, solving abstract visual puzzles, or reasoning tasks using nonverbal symbols. They try to minimize the role of language and specific schooling.
Okay.
These are seen as approximating what some theorists call fluid ability. Think of it as raw reasoning power, like potential energy, relatively uncommitted to specific knowledge. This is contrasted with crystallized ability, which is the result of applying that fluid ability to acquire a particular set of knowledge and skills, like vocabulary or general information.
Fluid versus crystallized, potential versus applied.
A useful distinction. While these two types of ability correlate closely in most people, culture-fair tests focusing on fluid ability are considered crucial for attempting to assess individuals from very different cultural backgrounds, or for making comparisons across groups, as they reduce, though perhaps never eliminate, the reliance on specific learned cultural knowledge.
That helps address the cultural bias concern somewhat. What about the charge that item selection is arbitrary, that psychologists just pick questions they like?
The source strongly rebuts this idea. Items are not arbitrarily selected for reputable IQ tests. They are chosen and refined based on objective psychometric principles.
Meaning
they are scientifically validated through rigorous statistical analysis. Their survival in the test depends on how well they measure the underlying construct, assessed by patterns of intercorrelations with other items and with external criteria within relevant populations.
it's data-driven selection.
Very much so. It's noted that items that correlate most highly with G, the general intelligence factor that emerges from factor analysis, tend to be those that best embody what psychologist Charles Spearman identified as 3 fundamental cognitive laws or processes.
Spearman's laws.
Yes. The apprehension of experience, basically encoding and understanding information, the adduction of relations, seeing connections and relationships between things, and the adduction of correlates, understanding implications, figuring out what follows from given information.
So the best items tap into these core cognitive processes.
That's the argument. It suggests that IQ testing, when done properly, isn't dealing with arbitrary collisions of facts, but is attempting to measure fundamental aspects of cognition based on true and testable scientific laws, giving scientific meaning and validity to the results.
That brings a much clearer scientific grounding to IQ testing than many might assume. Okay, let's shift gears now to the other big area of individual differences, personality. How do psychologists define and measure personality traits scientifically? And what about its scientific, maybe even biological underpinnings?
Right, personality. What's fascinating here and important for measurement is the distinction psychologists make between traits and states.
Traits versus states. Okay.
Traits are seen as relatively enduring characteristics that describe how a person typically behaves, thinks, or feels across different situations. For example, being sociable as a trait suggests someone consistently enjoys meeting people, goes to parties, and would probably be unhappy if deprived of company for long periods. It's a stable pattern.
Like a default setting.
Kind of, yeah. States, on the other hand, are temporary fluctuations or moods. Like feeling anxious right now before a presentation, but not being a generally anxious person.
The current condition.
Exactly. Personality research primarily focuses on understanding and measuring these stable, enduring traits that differentiate people consistently over time.
So how do they go about measuring these traits scientifically? It can't be as simple as just asking someone, are you sociable? Can it? People might not know or might want to seem sociable.
No, it's definitely more multifaceted than that, precisely because of those self-awareness and self-presentation issues. Psychologists use several methods. One is direct observation.
Watching people.
Yes, like systematically observing children in a school playground and having trained raters score their gregariousness or aggressiveness based on specific behavioral definitions. Or even counting specific behaviors, like the number of fidget movements someone makes during a boring lecture as a potential indicator of anxiety or restlessness.
Gives you a direct sample of behavior.
It does, which is valuable. But it has practical limitations. You can't follow people around all day, and observation itself can change behavior.
True. What else?
A second, and probably the most generally useful and widely used method, is self-report questionnaires. Personality inventories.
Filling out surveys about yourself.
Right. A prime example mentioned in the source is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI. It's a classic.
MMPI. How does that work? Is it just obvious questions?
Not necessarily. The MMPI famously uses what's called empirical keying. Items weren't selected based on whether they seemed logically related to a trait like, do you feel sad often, for a depression scale.
No. How then?
Instead, items were selected based purely on their statistical power to discriminate between different groups. For instance, a schizophrenia scale was built by finding questions that diagnosed schizophrenics answered differently, on average, than a large group of normal controls, regardless of the apparent content of the question. Some items might seem quite bizarre or unrelated.
It's purely about whether the item sorts people into the right diagnostic bins statistically.
Exactly. It's empirically derived. The MMPI also includes clever control keys or validity scales designed to detect biases in responding, like trying to fake good, present an overly positive picture, fake bad, exaggerate problems, or even just answering randomly or inconsistently.
Trying to catch people not being straight. Okay, what other methods?
A third method is other person ratings, getting ratings from people who know the subject well, teachers rating students, parents rating children, peers rating each other, supervisors rating employees.
Getting an outside perspective.
Right. This bypasses self-report biases, which is good, but it can suffer from its own issues, like the famous halo effect.
Halo effect.
That's where a rater's overall positive or negative impression of a person spills over and influences their ratings of specific unrelated traits. If they like someone generally, they might rate them higher on everything, even things they haven't observed closely.
Oh, okay. Bias from the rater.
Exactly. And finally, a fourth category mentioned is projective tests.
Like the ink blots.
Precisely. The Rorschach ink blot test is the most famous. Another is the thematic apperception test, or TT, which uses ambiguous pictures. The idea behind these is to get at more hidden, perhaps unconscious aspects of personality by analyzing the fantasy material people generate when asked to interpret vague or ambiguous stimuli. The assumption is they project their own needs, fears, and conflicts onto the stimuli.
More controversial, those ones, right, in terms of scientific validity.
Generally considered more difficult to score reliably and validate scientifically compared to questionnaires or objective tests, yes, but still part of the toolkit described.
Okay, that's a comprehensive set of approaches to measurement, but is there an underlying structure to personality? Is it just a jumbled collection of thousands of traits? Or are there broader, more fundamental dimensions that scientists have identified, maybe through that factor analysis you mentioned?
That's exactly where factor analysis has been incredibly influential. If we connect this to the bigger picture, one of the most prominent and well-researched models, heavily featured in the source, is the one developed by H.J. Eysenck. His work, using factor analysis on vast amounts of questionnaire and observational data, suggested that much of the variation in human personality can be boiled down to three major, reliably established factors or dimensions.
Three core dimensions. What are they?
The first is extroversion E, or more accurately, extroversion-introversion. This is the one most people are familiar with.
Outgoing versus quiet?
Basically, yes. But Eysenck proposed a biological basis for it. He linked it to differences in the baseline arousal level of the brain, specifically the ascending reticular activating system, ARAS.
Brain arousal, how does that relate?
His theory suggests that introverts' brains are naturally more alert or easily aroused. They have chronically higher cortical excitation.
They're naturally more switched on.
You could put it that way. This higher baseline arousal explains why they often prefer quieter environments, avoid intense stimulation, and can sometimes appear more inhibited. They're trying not to get overstimulated. Extroverts, conversely, are thought to have lower baseline cortical arousal.
They're naturally less fired up.
Right. So they actively seek out more external stimulation parties, excitement, social interaction, to reach an optimal level of arousal and feel engaged. This leads to the more disinhibited, outgoing behavior we associate with extroversion.
Fascinating. So extroversion and introversion might have a real biological basis in brain arousal levels.
Right.
What are the other two dimensions in Eysenck's model?
The second major dimension is neuroticism, N, which is sometimes referred to as emotionality versus stability.
Neuroticism.
Anxiety.
Moodiness.
Exactly. This factor is related to how emotionally reactive someone is. Eysenck linked this dimension to characteristics of the visceral brain, or limbic system, which includes structures like the hippocampus, amygdala, hypothalamus areas, deeply involved in processing and regulating emotion.
So higher N means more reactive emotionally.
Yes. Individuals scoring high in neuroticism tend to be anxious, moody, easily distressed, worry a lot, and react more strongly to stressful events. Those low on N are more emotionally stable, calm, and even tempered.
Okay. Extroversion and neuroticism. What's the third one?
The third major dimension, which Eysenck added later based on further research and which has gained increasing attention, is psychoticism, P, sometimes called tough-mindedness versus tender-mindedness.
Psychoticism. That sounds serious. Does it mean psychosis?
Not necessarily clinical psychosis, though there's a relationship. It's a bit of a problematic label, perhaps. Individuals scoring high on this P factor are described in the source as tending towards being cold, impersonal, aggressive, impulsive, egocentric, cruel, sensation-seeking, and antisocial.
A generally tough, maybe non-empathetic pattern.
That's a good way to think about it. It's important to note that while it's a continuous dimension in the general population, groups like diagnosed schizophrenics, manic depressives, psychopaths, and criminals do tend to score significantly higher on P scales, on average.
So it captures a kind of predisposition towards certain kinds of problems or behaviors. E, N, and P, extroversion, neuroticism, psychoticism. Those are the big three, according to Eysenck.
Yes, reliably identified through factor analysis across many studies and cultures, according to his work.
And do these biological roots and personality dimensions connect back to other psychological processes, like how we learn or process information? You mentioned introverts might avoid stimulation.
Indeed they do. Eysenck's theory makes specific predictions about how these biologically rooted personality dimensions should influence learning and cognitive performance based on arousal levels.
Like what?
For example, it's a reasonably well-established finding in psychology that high drive or arousal tends to interfere with immediate memory or performance on complex tasks, but it often benefits longer-term memory consolidation. Arousing experiences seem to get prioritized for transfer to permanent memory banks.
Okay, arousal hurts short-term, helps long-term memory.
Right. Now, since introverts are theorized to be chronically more aroused than extroverts at baseline,
I see where this is going.
the prediction is that introverts should show better long-term memory consolidation, but potentially poorer short-term memory or performance under pressure compared to extroverts.
Is that true?
Experimental results cited in the source have consistently confirmed this prediction across various types of learning tasks. Introverts tend to remember learned material better over longer delays. This shows how these foundational biological differences in arousal linked to personality can have cascading effects on cognitive processes like memory and learning. It connects the biological base to observable cognitive differences.
That's a really neat integration of biology, personality, and cognition. Okay, so we've covered how psychology establishes itself as a science, how it tackles learning, emotion, cognition, and individual differences like intelligence and personality, always keeping that biosocial interaction in mind. What does all this scientific understanding allow us to do in the real world? How does it help us understand something as complex as social behavior, group dynamics, and maybe even treat mental health conditions effectively?
That's the payoff, right? The application. The principles derived from scientific psychology have profound implications for both understanding social interaction and for clinical practice.
Let's start with social interaction. How does this help us understand relationships and groups?
Well, for instance, understanding interpersonal processes is absolutely central. The attachments human beings form, the bonds within families, close friendships, romantic and sexual partnerships, these are really at the very heart of human psychology and well-being.
Need to connect.
Fundamentally, research tries to measure aspects of these relationships. For instance, Girard's study from 1966, mentioned in the source, actually explored patterns of body contact and perceived intimacy among college students.
Measuring hugs and hand-holding.
Pretty much, yeah. He asked who they touched, where, and how intimate they felt the relationship was. He found, maybe unsurprisingly, that opposite-sex friendships involved the most total body contact, revealing measurable behavioral correlates of different types of intimacy. It's about quantifying these subtle aspects of relating.
Okay, and what about communication within those relationships?
In communication, there's a widely held idea, though the source cautions it might be an oversimplification, that the verbal aspects of a message primarily convey information.
The literal words.
While the nonverbal aspects, tone of voice, facial expression, body language, primarily convey emotion or attitude.
What you say versus how you say it.
Exactly. Argyle and colleagues in studies from the early 70s explicitly examined this. They created ambiguous messages where the verbal content might be positive, but the tone of voice negative, or the facial expression something else entirely.
Inflicting signals.
Right. And they had people rate how dominant or how warm-friendly the speaker seemed. They analyzed which channel words, tone, or face carry the most weight for judging those social-emotional dimensions. This kind of research helps us systematically dissect the multi-layered, often complex nature of human communication.
That makes a lot of sense. We definitely read more into how something is said than just the words themselves sometimes. And when people get together, whether it's just communicating or working on a task, group dynamics really come into play. What has scientific psychology revealed about social influence, like conformity?
Conformity. What's truly fascinating and sometimes unsettling here is how powerfully social context can shape individual behavior, even overriding our own judgment. The classic Asch experiment from the 1950s and 60s is the perfect illustration.
The line judgment study.
That's the one. Subjects were asked to judge which of three comparison lines matched a standard line, a really easy visual task. But they did it in groups where most other participants were actually Confederates, actors, instructed to deliberately give the wrong answer on certain trials.
So the real subject heard everyone else give an obviously wrong answer before it was their turn.
Exactly. And the question was, would they stick to what they clearly saw, or would they conform to the group's incorrect consensus?
What happened?
Even when the correct answer was perfectly obvious, subjects conformed to the wrong majority opinion about a third of the time.
A third of the time? Just went along with the wrong answer.
Yep. It showed the powerful pressure to conform. Asch also found that this conformity increases if the task is more ambiguous or difficult, and it increases with the size of the majority, up to a point. But, and this is hopeful, conformity drops sharply if even one other person in the group breaks ranks and gives the correct answer.
Having just one ally makes a huge difference.
A massive difference. It shows the power of dissent, even lone dissent, in breaking conformity's hold.
That's good to know. What about other group effects, like how performance changes when others are around?
Right, there's social facilitation. This was actually one of the earliest findings in social psychology by Triplett back in 1898.
Wow, that early?
Yeah. He observed that children winding fishing reels performed faster when they were racing against each other than when they were winding alone.
Competition helps.
Or just the presence of others. The general principle is that for sufficiently easy or well-learned tasks, the mere presence of other people acting as observers or co-actors tends to improve performance.
But not always, right? Sometimes an audience makes things harder.
True. Later research clarified that for complex or newly learned tasks, the presence of others can sometimes inhibit performance, possibly due to increased arousal or distraction, though the source focuses mainly on the facilitation effect here.
Okay, so presence of others helps simple tasks, might hinder complex ones. What about group decision-making? I've heard of something called the risky shift. Do groups make riskier decisions than individuals?
That was a prominent finding for a while, yes. The risky shift refers to the observation in many lab studies that when groups discuss situations involving risk, like whether someone should take a risky job offer, the group's final decision tended to be riskier than the average of the initial individual judgments of the group members.
Groups egg each other on towards risk.
That was one interpretation. However, it's not always a shift towards risk. The source mentions a fascinating field experiment conducted at a racetrack.
Betting on horses.
Exactly. Groups of 3 people had to discuss and agree on the same horse for a $2 win ticket. In this real-world betting scenario, the group discussion actually produced a shift towards caution compared to their prior individual betting preferences.
Opposite of the lab finding.
Right. It illustrates that while underlying principles of group influence might hold, the specific outcome, riskier or more cautious, can depend heavily on the specific context, the type of decision, and perhaps the initial leanings of the group members. It reminds us again of the complexity and context dependency of human behavior. It's not always a simple rule.
Definitely not simple. You also mentioned roles earlier. How much does the role we're playing influence how we act in a group?
The source suggests it can be incredibly powerful. It argues that role occupancy can sometimes be a more influential determinant of interpersonal behavior than the person's underlying personality traits.
The role overrides the personality.
To a significant extent in some situations. Brugada's 1961 study demonstrated this quite clearly. He had subjects interact in small groups, but first he assigned them to play either an explicitly assertive role or an explicitly submissive role for about 20 minutes. He also had prior measures of their natural assertive submissive personality tendencies.
Okay, so he knew their baseline personality and assigned them a role.
Correct. And he found that while their prior personality tendencies did have some influence on their behavior during the role-play session, the assigned role, being told to act assertively or submissively, was consistently more influential in determining how they actually behaved during that interaction.
People really stepped into the assigned part.
They did. It's a powerful reminder, as the source puts it, that we may all know our places and be able to play our parts when the occasion demands, regardless of our usual personality disposition. Think Zimbardo's prison experiment, although that's a more extreme and controversial example, not detailed here.
Right. That's quite profound, that the situation, the role, the hat you wear, metaphorically speaking, can shape your behavior so strongly, maybe even more than who you think you fundamentally are. Okay, let's move now to one of the most direct and important applications of psychological science, addressing abnormal behavior and clinical interventions. How does psychology use its scientific framework to diagnose and treat mental health conditions?
This raises an important question regarding how mental health disorders are conceptualized and approached scientifically, moving beyond just anecdotal evidence or tradition.
How does the scientific approach differ?
Well, rather than seeing mental disorders as completely distinct, separate categories, like different diseases, Eysenck, for instance, strongly advocated for a dimensional approach to diagnosis.
Dimensional, as opposed to categorical.
Exactly. This means disorders are viewed as exacerbations or extreme points on dimensions of normal personality traits, like the E, N, and P we discussed.
So someone isn't just depressed or not depressed, but they fall somewhere on a continuum of mood or neuroticism.
Precisely. Instead of a patient simply having schizophrenia or anxiety disorder as a fixed binary category, their diagnosis becomes more like locating a specific point in multi-factor space. The source uses the analogy of defining colors. You don't just say red or blue, you define a specific color by its precise position on 3 dimensions: hue, saturation, and brightness.
Gives you a much more nuanced picture.
It does. It allows for a more precise description and acknowledges that symptoms often co-occur. For instance, psychotic symptoms like delusions, high P, and neurotic symptoms like anxiety, high N frequently appear together. A dimensional approach handles this co-occurrence much better than rigid categories, suggesting the need for multidimensional assessment rather than forcing someone into a single diagnostic box.
That's a very different way of looking at diagnosis than the traditional medical model of discrete illnesses. So how did these scientific principles, particularly from learning theory, translate into actual therapeutic techniques for behavior change?
One of the most prominent and direct applications is in behavior modification techniques, which are rooted deeply in the principles of classical and operant conditioning we talked about earlier.
Okay, like what kind of techniques?
For example, there's a contrast drawn between systematic desensitization and implosion or flooding therapies, primarily used for anxiety disorders and phobias.
Desensitization versus flooding, what's the difference?
Systematic desensitization, developed by Joseph Wolpe, is a gradual exposure technique. It's often combined with relaxation training. The patient first creates a hierarchy of anxiety-provoking situations, from least scary to most scary. Then, while deeply relaxed, they gradually imagine or encounter these situations, starting with the easiest, until they can remain relaxed even when confronting the most feared stimulus. It's slow and steady.
Okay, gentle and gradual. What's implosion flooding?
Implosion or flooding therapy is basically the opposite. It involves intensive, prolonged, continuous exposure to the most anxiety-evoking stimuli, either in imagination, implosion, or in real-life flooding, without the possibility of escape, until the anxiety response extinguishes through exhaustion or relearning. The idea is to sometimes recreate the original trauma or fear situation intensely to force extinction.
Sounds much more intense.
It is. Potentially faster, but also potentially more distressing for the patient, and perhaps best suited for certain types of problems or individuals.
Makes sense. What other behavior techniques are there?
Another method derived from conditioning is aversion therapy. This is primarily used for socially undesirable, often compulsive behaviors like alcoholism, certain sexual deviations, as viewed at the time, or even things like compulsive gambling.
Aversion, making the behavior unpleasant.
Exactly. It involves pairing the undesirable behavior, or stimuli associated with it, with an unpleasant stimulus, such as a nausea-inducing drug for alcoholism, or, more commonly mentioned in this era, intermittent electric shocks. The goal is to create a conditioned negative association, reducing the urge or pleasure linked to the behavior.
Like counter-conditioning.
Precisely. The source even gives an interesting example of its successful use for treating writer's cramp, which isn't socially undesirable, but certainly distressing to the individual suffering from it.
Pairing writing with mild shock reduced the cramp. Okay. And how about managing behavior on a larger scale, like in institutional settings, hospitals, prisons?
For large-scale behavior control, especially in psychiatric institutions or sometimes in schools or correctional facilities, token economies have been effectively implemented, based directly on operant principles.
Token economies, like earning points.
It's exactly like earning points. In these systems, patients or residents earn tokens, chips, points, stars, for exhibiting specific desirable behaviors. These could be things like engaging in self-care, grooming, keeping their room tidy, participating in therapeutic activities, demonstrating appropriate social interaction, taking medication.
So rewarding good behavior with tokens.
Right. And then crucially, these earned tokens can be exchanged later for various desired rewards or privileges, maybe extra snacks, access to TV or recreation, preferred items, ground passes.
A whole mini economy based on reinforcement.
You got it. These systems demonstrate quite powerfully how operant conditioning principles can be applied systematically to manage and shape behavior within a controlled environment, often leading to significant improvements in functioning and cooperation, even on a large scale.
That sounds incredibly effective, potentially. But it also brings up some serious ethical considerations, doesn't it? If we're talking about controlling behavior with rewards and punishments, particularly with vulnerable populations like psychiatric patients, where are the ethical lines drawn? The source mentioned a very stark example involving Vietnamese patients and ECT.
This is indeed a critical area, and the source, to its credit, doesn't shy away from it. While many of these techniques have proven successful in helping people, for example, the source revisits the case of Sam the headbanging child, noting that shock therapy, though seemingly barbaric, was considered ethically justified in his specific case because no other alternative could preserve his sight, and the outcome was ultimately successful in stopping the self-injury.
So sometimes extreme measures might be justified by extreme need.
That's the argument in very rare cases. However, there are clear ethical boundaries that must not be crossed. Krasner in 1971 strongly critiqued what he called programs of coercion rather than genuine therapy.
Coercion? Like the EC2 example.
Right, exactly. He cited an instance where Vietnamese psychiatric patients were reportedly given a stark choice. Either receive ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, a procedure with significant risks and side effects, or agree to work in the hospital.
That's appalling. Using ECT as a threat to enforce labor.
That's how it was presented. The source argues this is a complete parody, a gross misuse of how learning principles should be applied ethically. The aim of behavior modification should always be to encourage adaptive behaviors that are genuinely in the patient's best interest and enhance their autonomy and well-being.
Not just to enforce compliance for the institution's benefit.
Precisely. Not just to enforce what someone in authority deems good behavior through coercion or threat. Because not only is coercion morally questionable, it's also unlikely to secure lasting behavioral change once the goad, as the source puts it, is removed. It's about empowering people towards better functioning, not simply forcing compliance while under duress.
A crucial distinction. It's about empowering adaptive behavior, not just forced compliance. Now, switching back slightly, what about the scientific scrutiny of more traditional non-behavioral therapies, like psychoanalysis? Does the source suggest they hold up to empirical testing?
The source definitely reflects a growing movement towards empirical validation in the 70s, and it critically evaluates some traditional therapies, particularly psychoanalysis. It highlights the need for more adequate scientific support for many core psychoanalytic claims.
Like what kinds of claims?
especially claims concerning the long-term effects of specific early childhood experiences on adult personality, things like particular child-rearing practices, for example, timing of toilet training, or the supposedly devastating impact of maternal deprivation.
These are classic psychoanalytic ideas.
They are. But the source states quite unequivocally that, based on the empirical evidence available at the time, satisfactory evidence does not exist for long-term negative effects stemming from mother-child separation, pure and simple, when other factors like overall quality of care are controlled for.
So the scientific evidence wasn't supporting some core tenets.
Right. It points to a crucial shift in psychology towards empirically validated treatments, where therapies are rigorously tested for their effectiveness using scientific methods, rather than simply being accepted based on tradition, theory, or charismatic founders. The source argues that many propositions of psychoanalysis, if they could be translated into precise, testable hypotheses with clear operational definitions, can and should be scientifically investigated. But the field demands that the outcomes of these tests be accepted, even if they are negative, without resorting to complex reinterpretations to save the theory.
A clear call for evidence-based practice, even back then. So, if traditional theories were being questioned, what has research shown actually makes counseling or psychotherapy effective? Are there identifiable factors that consistently lead to positive client change across different approaches?
Yes. Research has focused intently on this, trying to identify the active ingredients of effective therapy. One major line of research highlighted focuses on key therapist qualities or behaviors. Concepts like empathy, warmth, and genuineness, originally emphasized by Carl Rogers, were studied scientifically.
Empathy, warmth, genuineness. How do you measure those?
Researchers like Truax and Kharkov in the late 60s developed ways to operationalize these concepts. They showed that trained raters could listen to tape recordings of therapy sessions and reliably judge the extent to which the therapist displayed these conditions: empathic understanding, unconditional positive regard, warmth, and congruence, genuineness.
And did those qualities matter?
Generally, yes. Studies found that higher-rated levels of these therapist-offered conditions were associated with greater therapeutic change and more positive outcomes for clients across various types of therapy. It suggested these relational factors are indeed important.
So the therapist-client relationship is key. What about specific strategies? Does the type of counseling matter?
Beyond therapist qualities, studies also explore the effectiveness of different counseling strategies for specific problems. For complex issues like test anxiety combined with poor study skills, research suggested that simply providing counseling for the emotional dynamics wasn't enough. Neither was just teaching study skills alone.
What worked best?
Combining the two, a multi-model approach that included both directive, academic, help-like, explicitly teaching study techniques, and counseling for the underlying anxiety and emotional factors proved more effective than either approach by itself. It involved both didactic teaching and experiential processing, learning.
Tailoring the approach to the problem.
Exactly. Furthermore, research showed that the structure of counseling could matter depending on the client's personality. For example, one study found that structured group counseling with clear agendas and exercises was more effective for clients assessed as having high dependency needs, whereas more unstructured, open-ended counseling worked better for clients with low dependency needs.
Matching the therapy style to the client's needs.
Right. Providing what the study termed inappropriate counseling, like unstructured therapy for a dependent client, was found to yield no better results than no treatment at all. This highlights the growing specificity in counseling research, moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach towards more nuanced, tailored interventions based on empirical evidence.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground here. So, reflecting on all this, what does it all mean for us, the listeners? This deep dive has really shown us how psychology, through its, sometimes painstaking commitment to scientific methods, grapples with some of the most profound and complex questions about what makes us human.
It really does.
From measuring seemingly hidden thoughts and feelings to understanding intricate group dynamics and individual differences, it's a field that's constantly refining its tools, always trying to uncover both universal truths about human experience and the subtle nuances that make each of us unique.
Absolutely. And I think what we've seen is how psychology, as presented in this source, strives to be more than just abstract theories or armchair introspection. It's about rigorous observation, careful measurement, prediction, and always considering that constant dynamic interplay between our biological realities, our brains, our genes, our evolutionary heritage, and our social environments, our learning, our culture, our relationships.
The biosocial perspective woven throughout.
Exactly. It challenges us, I think, to look beyond simplistic single-cause explanations for behavior and to embrace the inherent complexity of human nature. The insights gained aren't always flattering in the traditional sense, as the source noted. They might reveal uncomfortable truths about our susceptibility to influence, or the limits of our rationality, or the biological roots of some of our traits.
Yeah, it's not always a comforting picture.
Perhaps not always comforting, but incredibly powerful. Powerful for prediction, for deeper understanding, and ultimately for developing more effective interventions, whether in education, therapy, or social policy.
This raises, I think, a really important final question for you, the listener, to maybe mull over after this. If our personalities, our intelligence, our emotional responses, even our attitudes and values are so deeply rooted in this complex interplay of our biology and our learned experiences through conditioning and social dynamics, to what extent are we truly free agents in shaping who we become? How much latitude do we really have versus how much of who we are is already wired in biologically or powerfully conditioned by forces often outside our immediate conscious awareness or control?
That's the fundamental question, isn't it? Free will versus determinism, seen through a psychological lens.
Definitely something to ponder. Where does agency fit into this biosocial scientific picture? Food for thought until our next deep dive.